America chose to lose the Vietnam War. It was completely unnecessary that the United States withdraw and allow South Vietnam to fall. It was the result of nothing more and nothing less than an immense and well executed psychological victory by North Vietnam and by the Viet Cong. And they were able to convince the American public that the war was unwinnable. The communist Vietnamese were able to convince the United States that it was a pointless, hopeless quagmire of a war that could never be won. That the only winning move was to just disengage and let the South fall and just try to get out of Vietnam, period. But that, and that is what has established itself in the popular imagination of the Vietnam War in the United States anyway. Every Vietnam movie, every book, or almost every book written on the subject has sort of reinforced that idea that Vietnam was a hopeless war, that ultimately the United States couldn't win because the stories go, we couldn't build a stable, authentic South Vietnamese state. We couldn't create an organic alternative to the communist North. And that is not completely false. South Vietnam always was an artificially propped up state, and it struggled throughout its entire existence to find a leader who could truly match Ho Chi Minh or any of his successors. And that is very true. Like every South Vietnamese leader was just either indifferent or hopelessly corrupt, and with varying degrees of competence. But ultimately, none of them were truly South Vietnamese patriots. They were just, they were just like warlords. They were just generals who saw the country as their own little fiefdom, and they just ran it like for their own personal benefit, and none of them truly cared about the South or maybe even Vietnam as as just on a purely patriotic, purely passionate, authentic kind of level. So that is true. The South always struggled to find an authentic national character. That is absolutely true. And so, there is, that's why why the North was so successful in organizing indigenous guerrillas and exploiting popular discontent, sometimes creating popular discontent in the South through manipulation and sabotage. But the North was able to undermine the South very easily, partly because the South struggled to find a real sense of self, and the North had a strongly defined sense of self and national character, and it was ruled over by, for the most part, genuine patriots who truly wanted an independent, unified Vietnam that was not beholden to a foreign power, and the South could never claim that. But even having said that, that doesn't mean that the narrative of Vietnam being a hopeless war is true, because it's not. Quite the contrary. At the time of the Tet Offensive, the United States had essentially ground down the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam to nothing. By that point, the North was well aware that their insurgencies and their guerrilla campaign was on every tactical level lost and hopeless. Far from it being that the U.S. and South Vietnamese were in a hopeless situation. It was actually the North and the Viet Cong who were in a hopeless situation. They couldn't, at that point it was, they had fought for a long time and they had tried their best and they had done damage, but the immensely superior U.S. forces had defeated them. In every military sense, the communist forces were defeated. There was just, they just were not able to match U.S. forces in any way. U.S. forces were just vastly superior, and the North Vietnamese could not do anything about that. And that's why I think it's interesting, in a lot of ways, the American side of the Vietnam War, it was, I suppose I should say that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong side of the Vietnam War was more of a farce and a play than anything. Because, which isn't to say that they didn't genuinely fight. They did. They fought well, but they were just never going to be a match for American forces once American forces came in country and in force in serious numbers. There was just nothing that the South, rather the North Vietnamese could do about it. And so it became more about the North and the Viet Cong and their Viet Cong proxies. It became more about them pretending to fight a real war, which isn't to imply that they didn't fight, but they knew that there was no real chance of a military victory, and they accepted that. At the time of the Tet Offensive, there was, the Viet Cong were badly depleted and they were losing on every front, and the leadership of the North, because they were actually very clever, very pragmatic. The North, that was, I think that was probably their along with their genuine patriotism and loyalty to their nation, I think the genuinely extraordinary cleverness and pragmatism of the North Vietnamese, that was probably their greatest strength, alongside their patriotism and their devotion to their cause. It was the fact that they looked at the situation, and at the time of the Tet Offensive, before that, and they accepted that there was no hope for a military victory at that point. They accepted that. They swallowed that bitter truth. They didn't just refuse out of pride. They looked at the situation, coldly and rationally, and they accepted that there was nothing they could do on a tactical level, on a military level, to win their war. So what they did was very ruthlessly, very cleverly, they did the smartest thing they could. They decided to gamble what was left of their forces in the South on a final massive assault against American and South Vietnamese positions, not with the intention of actually winning any battles, but purely for the purpose of frightening the American people, of making it seem like because at that point the American people had been told correctly, genuinely that was the case, that the Viet Cong were essentially defeated, that they had taken catastrophic losses and the Americans were winning everywhere, and the war was practically won, which was true. That was at its core fundamentally true. But then when the Viet Cong made their desperate suicidal attack during the Tet Offensive, that kind of convinced the American people that that had been a lie, when it hadn't. It was the truth. The truth was that the Viet Cong were practically defeated. They were on their last legs. That was true. But then this massive assault, where they're just throwing their lives away and causing chaos everywhere. The whole country, all of South Vietnam practically is engulfed in these just chaotic battles, and people are being killed left and right, and it's just chaos. That created the illusion of deception on the part of the American authorities and the American media. It made people think that they had been lied to. It convinced all the people who were already adamantly anti-war and opposed the war. It just convinced them that they had been right about their disbelief of the official line that the war was being won. It convinced them that they had been right about that the whole time. And a lot of people who were on the fence or even pro-war at that time, this sudden seeming reversal, this massive all-out attack on Tet, that changed a lot of people's minds. That made them reconsider, and it was all a lie. I mean, it was a brilliantly executed, planned and executed psychological victory over the anti-communist forces. The Tet Offensive has to be one of the most remarkable psychological victories, one of the most remarkable blows to morale of an enemy nation ever in the history of human warfare, because that single event, even though it achieved absolutely nothing of real strategic value, I mean, the Viet Cong forces were just, they took the Americans and the South Vietnamese off guard during the initial stages of the offensive, and they did a lot of damage, but they were swiftly, the North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong were swiftly pushed back and slaughtered. I mean, they ended up taking far greater casualties than any of the anti-communist forces, and it was just a bloodbath in the end for the communist forces. It was they not only did they achieve nothing of real military strategic value, they pretty much wasted, or not wasted, but they pretty much bled themselves all but dry of what blood they had left at that point. That was, and then obviously after that they rebuilt, but they were reduced to just meager scraps after the Tet Offensive, because that was their final. They were going to just wager their last few chips on this big on this just final gamble, because it's like, well, that's all we can do. It's risky, but it's it's ultimately like the only thing we can do. It's the smartest thing to do given how bad the situation was. And it completely succeeded. I mean, think about it. That won the war for the North. Even though they failed in every conventional, in every military sense, the offensive was a complete disaster and a complete failure and a complete waste of life. It nevertheless won the war for the North. That was their great coup. That was the turning point of the entire Vietnam War, and it completely demolished the American will to fight, because it convinced the American public and the American people, it convinced them that they were engaged in a hopeless war. It convinced them that they had been lied to the whole time by the people they trusted. It convinced them that they that there was no, because after all, it was like, well, look, we were told the Viet Cong were almost defeated and they were on their last legs. And then, this immense attack occurs and they're throwing their lives away with little regard. They're just, they're attacking with utmost ferocity and heedless of danger. And it seemed like there were so many of them because they hurled all of their remaining soldiers essentially at the enemy. And so it seemed like there were way more Viet Cong than the American people had been told. It seemed like they had been lied to, when in reality this offensive and the show of force that the North and the Viet Cong displayed during the Tet Offensive, that was the lie. I mean, that was the deception, more or less the official line that Americans had been told up to that point. Obviously it's exaggerated. It was propaganda, obviously. But nonetheless, that was the fact that Americans have been told that no, like the war is, obviously we're losing some men, and it's not perfect, but we are winning the war. Like that's what Americans had been told, and for the most part, that was fundamentally true. Like, yeah, the war was being won. The North and the Viet Cong were almost defeated. Their insurgency had basically been squashed. And that was much closer to the truth than what people believed after the Tet Offensive. Because after the Tet Offensive, they'd been successfully lied to by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And then, and so they were convinced, hey, no, this is we were lied to. This is actually a hopeless war. Like, all these anti-war people were right. This is a hopeless quagmire of a war. Like, look how strong the Viet Cong are. Look how strong the communist sentiment, anti-American sentiment in the South is. Because look at this huge uprising. It really convinced people of that. And it was a massive and enormously successful, brilliantly executed coup d'etat of psychological warfare that completely changed the course of the war and saved the communist side from defeat. At least, at that time. I mean, who can say if this hadn't happened and the war hadn't turned in their favor because of the Tet Offensive? I mean, who can really say whether what would have happened like 10, 15 years from that? I mean, who knows? Maybe the insurgency would have rebuilt itself. Maybe they would have tried something else. Like, the South still might have fallen. Who's to say? But at that time, the communist side had been very, very nearly vanquished. In a strategic sense, they were defeated. And that's why they embarked on this final all or nothing gambit, and it paid off, just spectacularly. They won the war because of that gamble. They gambled it. They gambled everything they had left, and they gambled the lives of tens of thousands of men and got a lot of them killed, and it worked. It paid off. And so I think it's just fascinating how I think most people, I don't know, I would say people of my age anyway. I mean, when I was younger, I know for a fact the prevailing idea of the Vietnam War was very much that it was a mistake to get involved. It was always a hopeless war. Like, all of the books I read about it, like they that was the line. That was the moral of the war, was that it was it was always a mistake to get involved. we could never win. America could never, the West, France, America, could never win because the Vietnamese people never really supported the West. And to varying degree, I mean, that's kind of debatable. Like that is not entirely false. In fairness, there, like as I said at the beginning, the South was always a fragile state. It never really had a strong national identity to try to counter the nationalist / communist sort of philosophy and identity of the North, because the North was what it was, and it was authentically what it was, and the South could never really figure out what it was. It was always like, so there was definitely, that is a part of it, but at the same time, it is also massively exaggerated that South Vietnam was doomed. In no way was it doomed. I think it's kind of like, in a lot of ways, it's a very different situation, very different, but it also has a lot of similarities between, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. I think if the Tet Offensive had failed, or if the American people had just had a stronger will to fight, had not been like so weak-willed and so willing to just give up and believe that it was hopeless, if we had just stuck with it, South Vietnam, I think, could have easily been saved. And in an alternate timeline, I think South Vietnam could easily still exist today, and I think it probably would have taken a similar course to to what happened in the Korean War. I think because like in a lot of ways, in the Korean War, like South Korea started off, I mean, as a puppet of America, as a puppet of the Western powers. It was just a military dictatorship for a long time. It was, it was not so dissimilar from South Vietnam, where it was like, it didn't necessarily have a super strong national character or an authentic identity independent of the Western powers at the beginning. But then, it survived, and then it developed one. And, obviously today it very much has its, own national character. Like in a lot of ways, it's the more authentically like real Korea compared to the North, which kind of morphed into a, some kind of strange distortion of, depending on how you look at it, strange distortion of like real Korean national identity. The South is probably closer in a lot of ways, because it's just more free. And so, a lot of like the more traditional Korean values, persist, and like the old national identity pre-division. But yeah, and so I think it's entirely realistic to say that South Vietnam could have survived, and if things had played out differently today, Vietnam might still be split in two, just like the Koreas, where there is a like pro-Western, pro-American South, and then a communist North, and they just have this uneasy, unending kind of quasi civil war, where it's never, it was never truly resolved in any meaningful way, and they just kind of, these two halves of the country split down the middle, just kind of developed, their own idiosyncratic identities, kind of, and then they just kind of stand apart, and may never be fully unified, because at this point, like the Koreas, they're just so they're so different in a lot of ways that it's like, will they ever truly unite? I mean, who knows? Even if the Kim dynasty was overthrown, might not the North just choose not to unify with the South, and maybe they would. I mean, it's hard to say. I guess maybe someday we'll find out. Someday, I mean, the Kim dynasty will be overthrown at some point. But who will replace them? And that's the question that we can't answer right now. But the whole thing about the Tet Offensive and that massively successful psychological victory that the North achieved. It shows that perhaps more than anything else, whether a nation is able to win a war comes down to the will to fight. Because ultimately, when all was said and done, on a military level, the United States had completely triumphed over the Viet Cong, over the North. In every, just like on every tactical military level, the North was defeated. And then, so militarily, the United States was vastly, just, overwhelmingly superior in every way. There's no matter, they fought extremely well and bravely, and they were smart, and they did their best, but the North and its proxies in the South just, could never really, they never really stood a chance, because they just could not defeat the overwhelmingly superior American war machine. So, militarily, practically speaking, the anti-communist forces had won. But then the American people couldn't back that up with the will to take those final few steps towards an ultimate victory. It was, America as a country didn't have the will to fight. They just didn't want to. They just didn't care enough. It just wasn't, it wasn't something that people were willing to keep putting up with. They weren't willing to, they weren't willing to be conscripted anymore. They weren't willing to, they were willing to, they weren't happy about it. They wanted the war to stop so that they'd stop hearing about Americans dying. Understandable. They wouldn't have to worry about being drafted. Understandable. It's understandable why people in America often didn't feel like it was a war worth fighting. But so America just ultimately didn't have the will to fight in that situation, and North Vietnam did. The communist forces did. They had the will to just keep fighting and just do whatever they had to. Like, they were just not going to give up. They continued to fight and continued to fight, and they just kept looking for opportunities, and they just kept, they maintained their will to fight. They had the willingness to try their very best to see their goals to fruition and see their people to victory, because they genuinely they were genuinely Vietnamese patriots first and foremost. They genuinely cared for and loved their people and their nation, and they, which isn't to say that they didn't do horrific things to their own people and their own nation also. That's that's an entirely different subject. But just as philosophically, they were patriots. Philosophically, they may have been communists, but they weren't, global communists. They didn't really care about a worldwide revolution, or they cared about Vietnam. They cared about the Vietnamese people as in concept anyway, abstractly, and they and so that was true to their hearts. They genuinely were willing to die for their cause. They were willing to suffer, and they were willing to put up with however long the struggle took, however much they had to suffer, however demoralizing it was at times to meet with defeat and defeat and defeat against this massively more powerful empire, this global empire that, and they were just they were just essentially this backwater that was resisting an overpoweringly superior global empire who just were. It's funny because it was, that's kind of it was actually a hopeless military struggle for the communist forces in Vietnam, contrary to what's in the public imagination, that it was a hopeless military struggle for the anti-communist forces for the United States. It was actually, it's more accurate to say that it was always a hopeless war for the North, for the communists, for the anti-American forces. They were the ones fighting a hopeless war in every military sense. But they had the will to fight. They had the will to endure. They cared about their cause. They cared about achieving victory at any cost. And that saw them through. That won the war. The fact that they could not militarily defeat the South or the American forces supporting it ultimately turned out to be, irrelevant to, or, maybe not irrelevant, but it wasn't the deciding factor. It wasn't what determined who won the war. It wasn't what determined what happened to Vietnam. It wasn't, it just, it was the will to fight. It was the morale of the people. It was their leaders. It was, who cared more. And the Tet Offensive just completely demoralized the American people. And, not complete, I mean, it as a whole, it demoralized the American people. Obviously, there was still a lot of people who wanted to keep fighting and who genuinely, cared about winning the war. But just as a whole, as a nation, I think that was the final blow that really, over time, transformed the whole outlook on it for the American people, and that the war was lost. Not necessarily, not that everyone realized it at the time. It took a long time to fully acknowledge that was the turning point, and after that there was no real hope of an American victory or enduring South Vietnam. But that was it. That was the blow. That was the final blow that started to bleed the American side dry of its will to fight, of hope. It became a hopeless war. It wasn't a hopeless war up until that point. And that's what I think is interesting, because the official line is more that it was always a hopeless war. But really, it was America's war to win or lose. Like, we decided what happened. I mean, if the American people had just been resolute and strong and not turned against the war, not turned against the idea of an independent South Vietnam, then the war would have been won. The United States would have easily won. If we had just, dismissed Tet, and we had just looked at it purely pragmatically and rationally, and there, the anti-war movement hadn't been so strong. There wasn't so much discontent with just fighting the war in the first place. If we had just been committed to victory, then we would have had victory pretty swiftly. And I mean, and as I said before, who can say what the future would have held after that, 20 years and, after Tet? I mean, who knows? Maybe the South still would have fallen at some point. It's kind of hard to say. Maybe the North would have fallen. It's not impossible. I mean, they were a pretty strong, unified nation, but it could have happened. Who knows? And it was just that was the straw that broke the camel's back, but it didn't need to be. The camel broke his own back. The United States we broke our own back, just by choice, because we just didn't, the spine was, the spine, the metaphorical spine, the will to fight was too weak. And so we just snapped our own back, and it was totally unnecessary. I mean, obviously in retrospect, we should have remained committed to the fight, because look at how disastrous it's been for the American pride and American national character after that. We still have the lingering mental scars and wounds and insecurities from our defeat in Vietnam. And it was just a totally unnecessary defeat. And by turning that victory into defeat the way the anti-war movement did, it didn't ultimately save. People kept dying. Americans kept dying for a long time after that. And it didn't end up really saving lives. It ended up costing more lives and resulting in the lives that had been expended up until that point, up until the Tet Offensive, to become, a waste. Like, they didn't need to be a waste. All the men who died, their lives were wasted because we gave up. And then everyone else who died, the Americans who died after that point, up until the point we finally got out, their lives were wasted. And all of the South Vietnamese people were, who were brutalized and killed by the North after the South fell, as the South fell, and after the South fell. I mean, all of it, that was unnecessary. We could have easily saved those people. Those people didn't need to die. We could have saved them. It just would have required a stronger spine. It just would have required that we have the will to fight, and we don't get so easily demoralized. So I guess that's the real message of the Vietnam War, I think, is far from it being like, oh, don't get involved in hopeless wars. I mean, in general, that's a good idea, obviously, but it wasn't a hopeless war, as I've said. That's my whole point. The moral, I think, to correctly take from Vietnam as a whole, or, the American involvement in Vietnam, is that don't give up hope. Don't get demoralized. Stick with it. Be realistic about what you can and can't do, and then just, it's you've got to keep your people, keep their morale up. You've got to keep people fervent about what you're doing. You have to like genuinely. You can't let people undermine their morale. You can't let people start convincing them that it's hopeless. Because the second they do that, the second you have people successfully arguing that your war is hopeless, then you're very close to defeat. And just one little thing can push you over the edge, which was the Tet Offensive. That was it. Like, the American will to fight was already tenuous. And then that was just that, that gave them the ammunition they needed to, the anti-war faction gave them the ammunition they needed to say, hey, look, we were right the whole time. We told you it was hopeless, and it was hopeless, and it is hopeless. And they were wrong. They were wrong. It was far from hopeless, but they managed to convince everyone and managed to demoralize everyone. And that was that. After that, no amount of just raw military strength mattered, because everyone just, or not everyone, a lot of people just wanted to get out. They just wanted it to be over with. And then at that point, you've lost. At that point, there's nothing you can do. It's not military strength that determines victory in war. It's the will to fight. I mean, obviously military strength is also, obviously you do need that also, but it's not necessarily the defining factor. You can be overwhelmingly militarily superior in every conceivable way, like the United States was in Vietnam, and you can achieve, just like, you're this far away from total military victory, but then if your morale takes a serious blow and people are convinced that it's hopeless and they should stop fighting, then they're going to want to stop fighting. And then that is going to mean defeat.